Chapter 1. The 43rd Inspection. The east wall was going to hold. Nora knew this because she had built it. She'd personally selected the limestone from the Dunmore quarry, personally supervised the mortar mix, and personally stood on this scaffolding in a rainstorm 3 weeks ago, while her senior stonemason, a man called Dougie who had been laying stone since before she was born, told her the whole thing would come down in the first frost. It hadn't come down. It wasn't going to come down. It was, in fact, one of the soundest pieces of structural work in her career, and she was standing on the scaffolding admiring the keystone placement when she heard the boots on the staircase below. She didn't look down. She didn't need to. Him, said the quiet thing in her, the part that tracked footsteps and scent and the particular weight of a man's stride before he reached the landing. She'd stopped arguing with it about 3 visits ago. Lady Dunmore. Your Majesty. King Desmond Blackwell stood at the base of the scaffolding in full court dress, which was to say entirely inappropriate for a construction site. Stone dust settled on the shoulders of his dark coat as he looked up at her with the expression of a man who had a legitimate structural concern and was absolutely not here for any other reason. Behind him, Lord Pemberton held a leather folder and the face of someone who had seen many things in 23 years of royal service and found this one the most tedious. I've had reports, the king said, about the mortar composition on the upper courses. Reports. From my engineers. I am your engineer. A pause. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that moved on instinct and wanted what it wanted without asking permission, the mortar concern is legitimate, Flint offered. It wasn't. It could be. It couldn't. The mortar was a 3-to-1 sand-lime mix, reinforced with horsehair exactly the way she'd specified. And Desmond knew this because she'd explained it to him on the 39th visit. He'd listened. He always listened when she talked about materials. He just never seemed to remember that he'd already heard it. He was already climbing the scaffolding. Nora watched him come up. The scaffolding was not designed for a man his size, which meant he had to turn slightly sideways on the last landing, which brought his shoulder close enough that she could smell him. Cedar smoke and cold iron, the forge scent that clung to anyone who trained with weapons before dawn. And underneath it, something warmer, stone in sunlight. She kept her face neutral. Her pencil stayed behind her left ear where it always lived, because her right hand needed to be free, and she pretended that his proximity was a professional matter. The upper courses look sound, she said. I'd like to see the north-facing section. The north-facing section is identical to the south-facing section, which you inspected on Tuesday. Nevertheless. Pemberton, still at the base of the scaffolding, opened his leather folder, consulted nothing inside it, and closed it again. The king moved past her. The scaffolding was narrow enough that his arm brushed hers. Neither of them acknowledged this. Neither of them stepped apart. Desmond looked at the wall. Nora looked at the king looking at the wall. His jaw was set in that particular way it got when he was performing concentration. His eyes, warm amber, wolf gold around the edges, tracked the stone courses with the seriousness of a man reviewing a treaty. His hands were clasped behind his back. He looked like a portrait of a monarch. He looked like a man who had run out of reasons to be here 20 visits ago and kept inventing new ones. She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear, or listening differently, the way wolves listened, with the whole body. He'd noticed this about her early on. She went still when she was reading a structure, a stillness that wasn't quite human patience, more like a hawk on a wire. The green of her eyes deepened when she did it, sharpening to something that had nothing to do with masonry and everything to do with the animal underneath. He'd never mentioned it. He noticed it every time. He's counting the stones, Moss observed. Just an observation, no opinion attached. The coursing is consistent, Nora said, because someone had to end this. Excellent work. You said that last time. It remains true. She almost smiled. She caught it, turned it into a professional nod, and tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear, the one without the pencil. Was there anything else, Your Majesty? There was. There was always something else. But the king of the Blackstone Dominion had not said what the something else was in 43 visits. and Nora Dunmore had not asked, and the wall between them was the one structure in this castle neither of them was qualified to demolish. "That will be all, Lady Dunmore." "Your Majesty." He descended the scaffolding. She watched him go, the way he always went, deliberately, without looking back, his composure as tight as the stonework she'd laid. "Him," Moss said again. Quiet, the way rain says wet. "I know," Nora said to no one. She was reviewing drainage plans at her work table in the half-finished gallery when the horn sounded. Not the short blast of a returning patrol, the full three-note sequence, a formal delegation approaching the gates. Nora set down her compass and listened to the rhythm of boots in the courtyard below, the shift in the castle's ambient sound from working hum to formal attention. Dougie appeared in the gallery doorway, stone dust in his beard, and an expression that suggested he had information he found personally entertaining. "There's a prince," he said. "There are several princes. This one came with flowers." Nora blinked. "Flowers," she repeated. "For you." She followed Dougie to the gallery window. In the courtyard below, a delegation of 12 riders was dismounting in formation. At its center, a man about her age, golden blonde, square-jawed, the kind of handsome that looked deliberate, was handing his reins to a groom and adjusting a cloak that was exactly the right shade of diplomatic blue. He held a spray of mountain wildflowers in his left hand. They looked slightly crushed from the ride, but still determined. Beside him, King Desmond stood in receiving formation. His posture was flawless. His expression was correct. Nothing about him suggested anything other than the composed welcome of a sovereign hosting a foreign dignitary. Flint had gone very still. "Who," the wolf said, "is that?" "Prince Lachlan Cairn," Pemberton murmured at the king's shoulder, consulting the actual contents of his folder for once. "Greymane territories, third in succession, here with a formal courtship proposal for Lady Nora Dunmore, as communicated by letter 3 weeks ago." Desmond did not move, did not blink. His hands stayed clasped behind his back. "I wasn't informed of a letter." "You were informed of the letter, Your Majesty. You initialed it." A beat. "We initialed it?" They had initialed it. On a Tuesday, between a border dispute and a grain tariff review, a single sheet requesting permission for a foreign prince to court one of the Dominion's landed ladies. He'd seen the name Dunmore. He'd read it clearly. He'd initialed it and set it in the completed pile, and not thought about it again. Because thinking about it would have required acknowledging why a courtship request for Nora Dunmore felt like a hand around his throat. And acknowledging that would have required saying something. And saying something was the one thing he'd spent 5 months not doing. It was registering now. Prince Lachlan looked up at the castle, the scaffolding, the half-restored wing, the general magnificent mess of Nora's project, and smiled. It was a good smile. Genuine, slightly crooked, the kind that suggested he found the world generally agreeable and expected it to agree back. "We're going to need a strategy," Flint said. Desmond watched the prince hand the wildflowers to a steward, with instructions to deliver them to Lady Dunmore's chambers. "How long is his visit?" he asked Pemberton. 3 weeks, Your Majesty, as per the letter you initialed." 3 weeks. From the gallery window above, Nora watched the king's jaw tighten by exactly 1 degree. Moss stirred, barely, like a cat repositioning in sunlight. "Him," Moss said, meaning Desmond. As always, only Desmond. But the flowers were nice. Chapter 2. The Campaign. Prince Lachlan Cairn was, unfortunately, not terrible. Nora had hoped for terrible. Terrible would have been simple, a preening boar she could dismiss over breakfast, a peacock in riding boots who'd last 3 days before the Blackstone weather broke him. She had built a man's share of walls in her career. She knew how to assess structural integrity at a glance. Lachlan's structure was annoyingly sound. He arrived at the breakfast hall on his first morning, sat beside her without maneuvering for it, and said, "Lady Dunmore, I should tell you plainly that I'm here to court you, and I intend to do it honestly. If at any point you'd like me to stop, say the word, and I'll enjoy the rest of my visit as a tourist." She stared at him. That's direct. I was told you prefer direct. Who told you that? Your brother. We met at the trade summit in Greymane last autumn. He said, and I'm quoting, "Don't waste her time with poetry. She builds things. She respects blueprints." Nora made a mental note to have a conversation with her brother about unauthorized distribution of her preferences. "I don't dislike poetry," she said, "but you'd rather see the plans." She almost smiled. The second almost smile in 2 days. She was going to have to watch that. From the head of the table, King Desmond watched this exchange with the expression of a man who was not watching this exchange. He cut his bread with geometric precision. His wolf was doing something that felt like pacing inside a space too small to pace in. He touched her arm, Flint noted. When he sat down, he touched her arm. It had been a brief, courteous contact, the kind anyone might make. Anyone, Flint repeated, should not be touching her arm. "He's a guest," Desmond said internally. "He's a problem. He's here by my invitation. He's here by your inattention. There's a difference." The wolf had a point. Desmond set his knife down and addressed Pemberton, who was eating porridge with the calm of a man immune to royal domestic crises. "Lord Pemberton, about Prince Lachlan's quarters." "The Blue Suite, Your Majesty, as arranged." "I've reconsidered. The Blue Suite is needed for storage. Move him to the Alder Tower." Pemberton's spoon paused. The Alder Tower was technically habitable. It was also north-facing, 3 flights of stairs from anything useful, and had a window that didn't quite close. The Alder Tower. "Is there a problem?" "No, Your Majesty." Pemberton's spoon resumed. "I'll have his things moved." "The Alder Tower has a draft," Flint observed. "A mild draft. A strategic draft. A coincidental draft. We're being very thoughtful about his comfort. We are being practical about storage." The wolf settled, smugly. The sabotage, once begun, acquired momentum. Over the next 4 days, Prince Lachlan found himself reassigned from the Blue Suite to the Alder Tower, draft. Then from the Alder Tower to the South Annex, damp. After the Alder Tower was declared structurally suspect by the king personally. His seat at dinner migrated steadily toward the far end of the table, chair by chair, until he was conversationally adjacent to Lord Pemberton's deaf aunt. His scheduled tour of the royal stables was cancelled due to an outbreak of temperament among the horses. His hunting assignment was paired with Gareth, the least competent tracker in the Dominion, a man whose primary skill was getting lost in rooms with one door. Lachlan took it all with grace. That was the infuriating part. "Your castle has a great deal of character," he told Desmond at dinner on the 4th evening, raising a glass from the seat between the deaf aunt and a pillar. "The annex rooms have a very particular atmosphere." "We value atmosphere," Desmond said. "I did notice the moss. Historic moss. On my pillow." Pemberton examined his wine with sudden fascination. On the 5th evening, Desmond rearranged the entire dinner seating plan so that Nora was at his right hand and Lachlan was between Pemberton's deaf aunt and the Dominion's master of drains, a man whose single conversational topic was exactly what the title suggested. Lachlan, seated next to a man describing the castle's grey water system in granular detail, caught Nora's eye across the table and raised his wine glass with an expression of cheerful surrender. Nora, who had not asked to be moved, looked at the king. Desmond was eating roast pheasant with surgical focus. He rearranged the table, Moss observed. Again. "I noticed. He put you next to him." "I noticed that too." "He's cutting his pheasant like it offended his bloodline." Nora pressed her lips together. There was something happening on her face that she was not going to let become a smile. She had been building things since she was 14 years old. She had a professional understanding of pressure, what created it, where it concentrated, how structures responded when it exceeded their design tolerance. She was watching a man exceed his design tolerance in real time, and the part of her that should have been offended was doing something else entirely. She watched the king's composure, that precise, managed surface he wore like armor, develop hairline cracks. She watched his gaze follow Lachlan across the great hall the way a wolf tracks movement at the edge of a tree line. She watched him rearrange schedules, reassign rooms, and manufacture logistical obstacles with the creative energy of a man who could have conquered a continent if he'd redirected the effort. She found it interesting. The king, who had never said a single personal word to her in 5 months, was suddenly doing quite a lot. He was doing everything, in fact, except the one thing that would have made all of it unnecessary. She thought about this in her workroom that night, drafting colonnade elevations by candlelight, her pencil behind her ear, and her tea going cold the way it always did when she was thinking about something that wasn't architecture. He saw her. She knew he saw her. It was in the way he listened. Not politely, the way Lachlan listened, but hungrily, like he was memorizing the technical details because they were hers and therefore mattered. He'd been memorizing her for 5 months, and the accumulated weight of his attention was the most specific, most flattering, most infuriating thing anyone had ever failed to say to her. If he would just say it. Him, Ma said, for the 40th time. Or the 400th. Nora had stopped counting. I know, but knowing and hearing are different things. And I can't build on a foundation nobody's laid. Him, Ma said, as Nora watched Desmond watch Lachlan compliment the wine. I know. Then why are we still pretending? Because pretending was the arrangement. She built his castle, he inspected her walls. They stood on scaffolding together and discussed mortar, and didn't talk about the fact that his scent made her chest ache in a way limestone dust and rosemary had no business competing with. That was the deal. It had always been the deal. Except now someone else was at the table. Someone who actually said things, out loud, with words. On the 6th day, Lachlan visited the construction site. He arrived in work-appropriate clothing. She noticed this, the effort of it, and asked genuine questions about the restoration process. How did she source the stone? What was the original structure's period? How did she manage a crew of 40 in a live castle? He was earnest. He was interested. He was also holding a trowel backwards. Other end, Nora said. Ah, he reversed it. I should confess I have no practical building experience. I'd gathered. My skills are more in the diplomatic line, he smiled, self-deprecating and warm. I'm very good at agreeing with people in rooms. She laughed, a real laugh, which she heard leave her mouth before she could stop it. From the far side of the courtyard, King Desmond, who had been walking past with absolutely no intention of visiting the construction site, stopped walking. He looked at the prince, holding the trowel. He looked at Nora, laughing. Something behind his ribs tightened in a way that had nothing to do with mortar. He made her laugh, Flint said. Not smugly now, flatly. Desmond crossed the courtyard. Lady Dunmore, Prince Lachlan. Your Majesty, Lachlan held up the trowel. I'm learning the trade. The blade angle is wrong, Desmond said. For pointing work on courses this tight, you hold it flush against the joint line and draw upward. 3 millimeter depth. She prefers horsehair reinforcement in the mix because it reduces shrinkage cracking in the frost season. Silence. Nora stared at him. The king stared at the wall. The prince stared at the king. Desmond realized what he had just revealed. That he'd absorbed 5 months of construction knowledge through the sheer gravitational pull of standing near this woman. And his jaw tightened. Common knowledge, he said. Is it, Nora said, not a question. Pemberton, who had appeared from nowhere with the instinct of a man who could smell a crisis from 3 corridors away, cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the Grain Council. Desmond left, quickly, with the dignity of a controlled retreat. From the scaffolding, Nora watched him go. The pencil behind her left ear, the strand of hair escaping her braid. The expression on her face that she would not, under any professional circumstances, have called fond. Lachlan watched her watch the king. He knows about horsehair reinforcement, the prince said mildly. Apparently. How many times has he visited this site? Nora thought about lying. She didn't. 44. Lachlan nodded slowly. Then he set down the trowel, right side up this time, and said, I think I understand the structural situation a bit better now. Chapter 3. The Scaffolding. It rained for 3 days. The kind of blackstone rain that came sideways off the mountains, turning the courtyard into a shallow lake and the construction site into a discipline problem. Half the crew couldn't work. The other half wouldn't. Nora spent the mornings arguing with Dougie about waterproofing timelines and the afternoons reviewing drainage plans that were becoming urgent. The sabotage, meanwhile, had acquired a creative ambition that bordered on artistry. On the 7th day, before the rain started, Desmond had Lachlan's horse, a handsome bay gelding, replaced with what the stablemaster diplomatically called a more terrain-appropriate mount. It came up to the prince's knee. It was technically a horse in the same way the alder tower was technically habitable. Lachlan rode it to the morning hunt without complaint, though the hunting party's attempt to maintain diplomatic composure was tested to structural failure. On the 8th day, a formal breakfast was rearranged so that Lachlan's seat faced directly into the morning sun, requiring him to squint through the entire meal, while Nora, who had been placed on the king's shaded side of the table, ate her porridge in comfortable visibility. On the 9th day, Lachlan arrived at the library to find that every book on architecture, construction, and Dunmore regional history, the subjects he'd been studying to impress Nora, had been relocated to the king's private study for cataloging. Cataloging, Flint repeated, with the satisfaction of a wolf who had found the perfect intersection of petty and strategic. It's a legitimate archival process. It is the finest work we have ever done. Lachlan took all of it with grace. This was the worst part. At dinner on the 9th evening, the prince, who had been seated next to the master of drains for the 4th consecutive night, leaned across the table and said to Desmond with perfect good humor, "Your Majesty, I want you to know I've learned more about your castle's sewage system than any foreign dignitary in history. I believe this makes me an asset to the Dominion." Desmond looked at him. Something behind the king's eyes, something gold and animal, and not entirely under management, held steady on the prince for 3 seconds too long. The kind of stillness that wasn't quite human. Predator still. The gaze of something that had identified a rival and was deciding, on a level beneath thought, what to do about it. Lachlan saw it. The prince's easy smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind it. Recognition. He had grown up in wolf territory. He knew what he was looking at. He raised his glass. "To diplomatic hospitality." "To hospitality," Desmond said, and drank. The rain started that night. The king did not visit. This was notable because the king had visited every day for 5 months, rain or shine, structural concern or no structural concern, and his absence left a shape in the air that Nora refused to examine. Moss examined it. "He's not here." "I noticed." "He's usually here." "I am aware of his habits." "You're drawing the same drain line for the 3rd time." Nora looked down. She was, in fact, drawing the same drain line for the 3rd time. She set her compass down and pressed her palms flat on the work table. She was not going to think about why the king had stopped visiting. She was not going to wonder if the prince's presence had altered the equation, whether Desmond had looked at Lachlan's directness, his easy smile, his ability to actually say things out loud with his actual mouth, and decided the inspections were no longer worth the pretense. She was going to think about drainage. "Him," Moss said. Quiet and certain, the way it always was. But him wasn't here. On the 4th day, the rain thinned to a persistent drizzle, and Nora went up to the scaffolding alone. She needed to check the upper courses for water damage. The mortar was cured but young, and the first sustained rain was always the test. The limestone was holding. The joints were clean. The horsehair reinforcement had done its work. She ran her fingers along the courses and felt the wall's integrity like a pulse, steady, solid, hers. She heard the boots on the staircase. Her hand went still against the stone. Limestone dust and rosemary and the sharp green of rain on her skin. And underneath it, rising through the stairwell, cedar smoke and cold iron. Warm stone in sunlight. He appeared on the landing. He wasn't in court dress this time. A simple dark shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows, rain in his hair. He looked like a man who'd come here in a hurry and hadn't stopped to decide what he was supposed to be doing when he arrived. Lady Dunmore, Your Majesty. He stopped, looked at the wall. Water damage concerns. The wall is sound. I should verify. You've been absent for 3 days. The words left her mouth before she'd authorized them. She heard them hang in the wet air between them and did not take them back. Desmond climbed the last section of scaffolding. The landing was narrow, narrower than usual with the rain making everything close and damp. He stood beside her. His shoulder was 6 inches from hers. She could feel the heat of him through the chill, could smell him clearly now, the cedar smoke sharpened by rain, the cold iron softened to something warmer underneath. Her pulse did the thing it did. She ignored it the way she always ignored it, by focusing on something structural. The upper courses show no penetration, she said, running her hand along the mortar line. The horsehair reinforcement performed as designed. I tested 3 joints this morning, all firm. He was looking at the wall the way he used to look at the wall, with that careful, measured attention that was so precisely calibrated to appear professional. But his breathing was different. She could hear it. The slight catch at the top of each inhale, the way it didn't quite settle. Wolves have very good hearing. She'd been pretending not to have very good hearing for 5 months. I didn't want to be in the way, he said. His voice was lower than his court register, closer to the real one, the one that came out in fragments when his composure was handling too many things at once. You've never been in the way. He looked at her, not at the wall, not at the stone courses, not at the mortar joints he'd been pretending to inspect for 5 months. At her. His eyes, amber at the center, darker at the edges, held something she'd only caught in glimpses before. The thing beneath the inspection. The thing he kept managing. She looked back, let herself look, felt the wolf in her go very still. Not with urgency, but with recognition. The way you go still when you see something you've been waiting for. The rain came harder. It drummed on the scaffolding boards above them, ran in thin sheets down the stone beside them, sealed them into a narrow space that smelled of wet limestone and cedar and the specific, unbearable closeness of a man who was standing exactly where she wanted him and would not close the last 6 inches. The wolf in him, Flint, who had been running tactical assessments and sabotage campaigns and gleeful competitive strategies for a week, went quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't silence, but attention. Every part of the animal focused on one thing. Say it, Flint said. Not smugly, not as a co-conspirator. The way you say breathe to someone who's forgotten. Say it. He didn't say it. What he did was take off his coat, the dark one, damp from rain, warm from the heat of him, and settle it over her shoulders without being asked. His hands stayed at the collar, adjusting, his fingers near her jaw, close enough that she felt the warmth of his skin without the touch. The coat smelled like him. She pulled it closer without deciding to. Thank you, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. His hands were still on the collar. He hadn't let go. The 6 inches between them had become 4, and she could see the exact moment he realized this. The slight widening of his eyes, the way the gold flared at the edges of his irises, involuntary, the wolf surfacing in a flash of amber that was there and gone. She could feel his heartbeat, not through the coat, through the air between them. The accelerated rhythm of it, the thing she'd been pretending not to hear for 5 months. It was doing the thing again. The thing it only did when he was looking at her. She tilted her head. The pencil behind her left ear caught the faint light. A strand of auburn hair, dark with rain, lay against her cheek. Her eyes had gone deep, the green darkening the way it did when the wolf was close, when she was reading something with more than her human senses. He could see it, the slight dilation of her pupils, the way her breathing had changed, slower, steadier, the rhythm of something that was tracking him with an attention that had nothing to do with construction. She knew what his heartbeat was doing. He could tell because she was very carefully not looking at his chest. He could have kissed her. They both knew it. The scaffolding was narrow enough. the rain loud enough, the rest of the world distant enough. His hand was still on her collar. Her face was tilted up. The space between them was the only unbuilt thing in this entire castle. She let it stay. "The mortar's holding," she said, because someone had to say something, and what she wanted to say was something neither of them was ready for. "You do excellent work, Lady Dunmore." "You've said that 44 times. It remains, if you say true, I will drop this trowel on your foot." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of one, the kind that lived in the managed mode cracks. He stepped back. She watched him go down the scaffolding, and the space where he'd stood was warm, and then it wasn't. "Him," Moss said. But it was different this time. Softer, like an ache that had finally found the right name for itself. That evening, Lachlan found Nora in the courtyard garden. The rain had stopped. The castle grounds smelled like wet earth and the juniper hedges that lined the walking path. Nora was sitting on a stone bench with her drainage plans and a cup of tea that had gone cold. Lachlan sat beside her without asking. She noticed this, the ease of him, the way he occupied space like it was his, and he was willing to share. Nothing like Desmond, who occupied space like he was maintaining a perimeter. "Your restoration is remarkable," he said. "I walked the East Wing today. The stonework is extraordinary." "Thank you. I imagine it requires total focus." "It does. And yet, the king seems to require a great deal of your attention." Nora sipped cold tea and did not answer. Lachlan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His expression shifted, the charming prince veneer thinning to show something underneath that was simply a man being honest with a woman he admired. "I'll say this once," he said. "I know I'm competing with someone who won't compete. I think you know who you'd choose if he asked. But he hasn't asked. And I have. I'd like a fair chance, Nora. Not because I think I'll win, I'm not sure I will, but because I think you deserve someone who shows up with his whole voice, not just inspections." She set down her tea. She looked at him, this decent, direct man who'd ridden 3 days to say what the king of the Blackstone Dominion couldn't manage in 5 months of scaffolding visits. Lachlan wasn't wrong. He was offering something real, a man who would speak, who would show up openly, who would never make her wonder. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. A life in the Greymane territories. A man who brought flowers and said things plainly and never once made her stand on scaffolding waiting for a sentence that wouldn't come. Lachlan would be kind. He would be present. He would tell her what he wanted on the first day and every day after, and she would never have to decode an inspection for hidden meaning. It would be fine. It would be clear and honest and fine. And it would not be the man who remembered horsehair reinforcement because she'd mentioned it once. It would not be the man who stood 6 inches away in the rain and couldn't close the distance and couldn't leave. It would not be cedar smoke and cold iron, and the way his voice dropped half an octave when he forgot to manage it. She was not torn. She had never been torn. She was furious. At the man she wanted for making her wait, and at herself for waiting. "Him," Moss said, with the quiet certainty of a wolf who had never once considered the alternative. But him wouldn't say a word. And Lachlan was right here, saying all of them. "You deserve an answer," Nora said. "I don't have one yet." It was a lie. She had an answer. She'd had an answer since the 3rd inspection. But the answer required a foundation that only one person could lay, and he was somewhere in this castle rearranging library shelves instead of speaking. "That's fair." He stood. "Take your time. I'm in the South Annex, the one with the historic moss." She laughed, despite everything. He smiled. The real one, slightly sad around the edges, and left her in the garden with cold tea and a decision she already knew the shape of, but couldn't make until the other person in it stopped hiding behind mortar reports. Chapter 4. The Mirror. It happened on the 9th day. Desmond had spent the previous evening in his study, not sleeping, reviewing construction schedules he'd already memorized. The East Wing restoration was ahead of Nora's projected timeline. She'd be finished in 6 weeks. She'd present to council, receive her commission, and return to Dunmore. She'd leave. The thought arrived like a structural failure, sudden, total, load-bearing. She'd been here for 5 months, and she'd leave because that's what contracted work was, temporary by design. And he'd let 5 months of scaffolding visits accumulate without once saying the thing that would give her a reason to stay. "We could extend the project," Flint offered. It was 3 a.m. The wolf had been unusually quiet all day, and when it finally spoke, the smugness was gone. What was left sounded like something closer to desperation. "I've already extended the project. Twice. We could add a wing." "I'm not adding a wing to the castle to avoid a conversation. A small wing, a practical wing, one that requires her specific expertise for approximately the rest of time." Desmond pressed his palms against the desk and breathed. "This isn't a scheduling problem." Flint said nothing, which meant Flint agreed, which meant Desmond was out of co-conspirators. The next morning, he did something unforgivable. He reassigned Nora's senior construction crew, 12 of her best stonemasons, including Dougie, to build temporary banquet facilities for a diplomatic reception honoring Prince Lachlan's visit. The reception was real. It was standard protocol for a visiting delegation's second week. The timing was not standard. The venue choice, an outdoor pavilion requiring full construction, was not standard. The fact that it pulled Nora's team at the exact point in the restoration when the Western Colonnade needed continuous attention was not remotely standard. It was, as Pemberton observed with the precision of a man who'd been waiting for this particular disaster, a scheduling decision that appears to prioritize diplomatic hospitality. It was the king, using Nora's project as leverage. Not to win her, to keep her. To delay the restoration, extend her contract, buy more time for conversations he wasn't having. He was manipulating the work she'd poured 5 months of her life into because he couldn't manage the sentence, "I want you to stay." Nora found out at noon. She went to the throne room. She did not request an audience. She walked in during the midday recess when the hall was empty except for Desmond, Pemberton, and 3 advisors reviewing trade documents. The advisors took one look at her face and found urgent business elsewhere. She stopped 10 feet from the throne, limestone dust on her boots, the pencil behind her left ear. Her eyes, forest green, the color of the deep Dunmore woods, fixed on the king with the precision of a woman who built load-bearing structures and could identify the exact point where one was about to fail. "You reassigned my crew." Desmond set down his documents. "It's a scheduling adjustment. 12 stonemasons, including Dougie, who I've worked with for 6 years, pulled from the Western Colonnade at the most critical stage of the cure. The diplomatic reception requires don't." The word stopped him. Not the volume, she hadn't raised her voice. The quality of it, the blade of it. "This is the 44th time you found a reason to interfere with my work," she said. "But it's the first time you've done it for someone else's benefit. Every inspection, every mortar concern, every scheduling adjustment, I let them go because I understood what they were. But this," she gestured at the empty hall, the throne, the whole machinery of his authority. "This is my project, my work, my crew, and you moved them like pieces on a board because you can't say what you actually want." Desmond stood. The throne room was very quiet. Pemberton had acquired the stillness of a man who had become furniture. "Tell me why you keep coming back," Nora said, "or stop coming." The silence between them had weight. It had mass. It was the silence of 44 visits worth of unsaid things pressing against a surface that was finally cracking. He opened his mouth. He closed it. She watched him fail. Watched the most powerful man in the Dominion, the Alpha King who could command armies and negotiate treaties and hold a council room with a single sentence, stand mute in front of a woman with stone dust on her boots. "Say it," Flint said. But the wolf's voice was small. The co-conspirator was gone. The smugness was gone. What was left was something that sounded afraid. Desmond said, "I'll reassign your crew back, immediately." Nora looked at him for a long moment. What she was looking for, she didn't find. "Do that," she said. She left. The throne room settled into the kind of silence that follows structural collapse. Pemberton, very carefully, began gathering documents. Desmond sat back down. His hands were steady. Everything else wasn't. Lachlan found him in the corridor outside the throne room. The prince had the particular expression of a man who'd heard raised voices through stone walls and drawn accurate conclusions. "Your Majesty?" "Prince Lachlan." They stood in the corridor, 2 men, 1 crown between them, and a woman neither of them deserved walking away from both. Lachlan dropped the diplomatic register. "I'll say this because no one else will, and you need to hear it." His voice was quiet, no charm in it, just one man talking to another. "You're going to lose her. Not to me. I'm not sure I ever had a real chance. I've spent 9 days courting a woman who hears everything I say and is listening for someone else's voice." Desmond's jaw tightened. The wolf in him was very still. "You're going to lose her," Lachlan said, "because she needed you to say it, and you couldn't. Because you inspected her walls 44 times instead of saying one true thing. And a woman like that, a woman who builds things that last, won't wait forever for a man who's afraid of his own voice." The prince held his gaze. Then he inclined his head, a formal gesture properly executed, and walked away. Desmond stood alone in the corridor. Flint was silent. Completely, terribly silent. No sabotage plans. No co-conspirator scheming. No smug assessments of the rival's weaknesses. Just the animal part of him, the part that wanted what it wanted without management or strategy or the careful distance of kings sitting in the wreckage of every excuse he'd ever built. He leaned against the stone wall. The corridor was cold. Somewhere below, the construction site was continuing without its crew, and the woman who built things that lasted was reassessing whether anything she'd been waiting for was going to hold. He pressed his forehead against the stone. There was a reason he didn't say things. There was a reason the inspections had been enough, or had seemed enough, or had been all he could manage. His father had been an open man. Desmond remembered this the way you remember a structural failure, not the moment of collapse, but the details leading up to it. His father had loved openly, ruled openly, wanted openly. He'd walked through the palace with his feelings on the surface where anyone could see them. And the council had used every one. Had mapped his attachments, identified his vulnerabilities, applied pressure at the joints until the structure failed. His mother had left when Desmond was 12. Not because she stopped loving his father, because his father's openness had made her a target. And the weight of being the thing a king couldn't hide had crushed the joy out of every room she entered. Desmond had been crowned at 19, and the first thing he'd learned was this: a king who wants openly gives his enemies a lever. The second thing he'd learned was worse. A king who wants openly gives the person he wants a burden. So he'd learned to manage, to inspect walls instead of speak, to rearrange seating charts instead of say, "sit beside me," to build a careful, controlled distance between himself and the woman who smelled like rosemary and talked about load-bearing structures like they were sacred. Because if he closed that distance, if he said the word, she would become the thing everyone could see, the thing the council could use, the weight another person would have to carry. He'd been protecting her from himself, and in doing so, he'd built the one wall neither of them could live behind. "She's leaving," Flint said. Not smugly, not strategically. The way a wound says bleeding. "I know. In 6 weeks, when the project ends. She goes back to Dunmore." "I know. 44 visits." "I know." Flint said the thing that neither of them had said, the thing beneath the sabotage and the inspections and the mortar concerns and the scheduling adjustments and every single careful, managed, cowardly pretense. We love her. Desmond closed his eyes. The stone was cold against his forehead. His hands were flat against the wall. The corridor was empty and quiet, and it smelled like nothing and no one. Yes, they did. And love, it turned out, was the most load-bearing thing there was. You couldn't inspect it. You couldn't schedule around it. You couldn't rearrange it to the far end of the table. You could only carry it into the room and set it down in front of someone and hope. Hope like his father had hoped. Hope like a man who'd watched hoping destroy a family and had sworn he'd never do it. That the structure would hold. Chapter 5. The Cornerstone. It was past midnight when Desmond found her, the construction site. Where else? The western colonnade, where her crew had been pulled and reassigned and returned in the space of a single day. He'd sent the order within the hour. Dougie and all 12 stonemasons back where they belonged, no explanation offered. The work had resumed. The mortar was wet. Nora was alone on the scaffolding, working by lantern light. She did this sometimes. Went up alone after hours, when the castle was quiet and the stone was cool, and she could press her hands against the wall she was building and feel it settle into itself. The wall didn't need her at this hour. She needed the wall. She heard him coming from a long way off. Cedar smoke and cold iron carried on the night air through the colonnade arches. She knew the weight of his step. She knew the particular silence that preceded him, the way the air changed when the king entered a space, as if the room itself was paying attention. She didn't look down. She didn't say, "Your Majesty." He climbed the scaffolding, slowly, without the pretense of an inspection or a structural concern, or a leather folder, or Lord Pemberton. Just him. Just the dark shirt and the rain-damp hair, and the look on his face that she had never seen before. Not managed, not composed, not arranged. Open. Afraid. He stood on the landing beside her. The lantern light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the scar on the back of his right hand, the amber of his eyes where the wolf lived close to the surface. She could see flint in the gold around his pupils, not scheming, not plotting, not running interference. Just looking at her. "No mortar concerns," she said. "No." "No scheduling adjustments." "No." "Then why are you here?" He took a breath, let it go. The controlled exhale of a man who'd spent a lifetime managing what came out of his mouth. "You put your pencil behind your left ear," he said. She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, this was not among them. "You're right-handed," he continued, "but you keep the pencil on the left side. I spent 2 weeks trying to work out why before I realized. You keep your dominant hand free, so you can gesture when you're explaining load distribution. You talk with your hands when you're passionate about the structure. You don't know you do it. I noticed on the 3rd visit." The air between them shifted. Something in her chest rearranged itself around the fact that he'd spent 2 weeks on the pencil. 2 weeks. On a pencil. "You argue with Dougie about limestone sourcing every Tuesday morning," he said. "You're always right. You never gloat. You just hand him the sample and wait for him to come around on his own. Which he does, every time, because you chose the better stone and you both know it. You once told me the Dunmore Quarry produces the finest limestone in the Northern Territories, and I believed you because you said it the same way you say everything, like you'd built the evidence with your own hands and you were simply presenting the structure of it." Nora's hands were very still on the scaffolding rail. Her throat was doing something. She kept her face steady. "You hum when you're measuring, a song I don't know the name of. Something without words, just a melody you carry in the back of your throat. You stop the second you think someone might hear. I've heard it 11 times. You never knew I was listening." His voice was low. Not the court register, not the managed mode, not the careful precision of a king addressing a subject. This was the other one. The real one. The one she'd caught in fragments on rainy scaffolding and never heard long enough to learn. It sounded like it cost him something to use it. Like every sentence was a stone he was laying without mortar, hoping the weight of the ones above it would hold them all in place. "You say load-bearing the way other people say beloved. like it's the most important word in any language. Like if a thing can hold weight, it deserves respect. And you're right. You're right about that. I know because I've been watching you build things that hold for 5 months. And the way you talk about what lasts, the materials, the joints, the foundations, is the way I've been trying to talk about you. And failing. For 44 visits. He stopped. He was breathing like he'd been running. He was standing still. I have been finding reasons to be where you are for 5 months, he said. Every inspection was a lie. Every scheduling adjustment was a lie. The mortar concerns were, well, the one on the east wall after the first rain was actually legitimate. She made a sound, almost a laugh, almost. Her eyes were bright in the lantern light. But the rest of them? All of them. I kept coming back because you were here, and I couldn't stop. I built 44 pretexts because one truth was too heavy for me to carry into a room. His hands were at his sides, open, not clasped behind his back, not behind the formality, not behind anything. I was afraid. I am afraid. I have governed a kingdom since I was 19 years old, and I have never been as terrified of anything as I am of the sentence I should have said on the 3rd visit. The lantern flickered, stone dust in the air between them. Her pencil behind her left ear, his eyes gold at the edges. What sentence? She said. She knew, but he needed to say it. He needed to carry it into the room himself. Stay, not the contract, not the project. You, Nora. Stay because The word stuck. The enormous, unmanageable, load-bearing word. He forced it through. Because I love you. Because I have loved you since you explained horsehair reinforcement to me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I didn't understand a word of it, and I didn't want you to stop talking. The silence that followed was not the silence of the throne room, where words disappeared into stone. It was the silence of the scaffolding. Small, close, warm with lantern light. Him, Moss said. One last time. The quietest it had ever been. Not urgent, not insistent, not pointing toward something Nora hadn't noticed. Just settling. The way a foundation settles when the weight above it is finally right. 44 inspections, Nora said. 44? And it took a rival prince to make you count them. It took a rival prince to make me realize I'd been counting all along. She looked at him. The king of the Black Stone Dominion, standing on her scaffolding in a plain shirt with rain in his hair, and the most unguarded expression she'd ever seen on a face built for composure. He looked like a man who just set down something very heavy. He looked like a man who wasn't sure the floor would hold. It would hold. She'd built it. Lachlan is a good man, she said. I know. He was direct. He was honest. He showed up with his whole voice on the first day. I know. And I was never torn. Not once. He stared at her. The gold in his eyes flared, involuntary, the wolf surfacing in shock. Flint breaking through the composure in a flash of amber that caught the lantern light. I was waiting for you, she said. I was waiting for you to stop inspecting the walls and see me standing in front of them. I knew after the 3rd visit, maybe the 2nd, you listened to me talk about mortar like it was the most important thing anyone had ever said. Nobody listens like that. Nobody holds a conversation about limestone density for 20 minutes and remembers every word 3 months later. You saw me. You always saw me. You just wouldn't say it. She stepped toward him, one step. On the narrow scaffolding, it closed the distance to almost nothing. Nora, I am tired, she said, of being the only one who knows what this is. He reached for her, not the way a king reaches, not measured, not managed, not arranged, the way a man reaches who has stopped thinking about everything except the fact that she is right here. His hand on her jaw, his thumb against her cheekbone, her skin warm under limestone dust. The growl he'd been swallowing for 5 months rose in his chest, low, involuntary. the animal truth of it vibrating against her palm when she laid her hand flat over his heart. "Your heartbeat," she said. "I've been pretending not to hear it every time you stand next to me. Wolves have very good hearing." "I know." "It does a thing when you look at me." "I know." "Are you going to kiss me, or are you going to inspect the mortar first?" The sound he made was not quite a laugh. It was something rawer, the crack in the composure that wasn't a crack at all, but an opening. A door he'd been leaning against for 5 months, finally letting go of the handle. He kissed her, not carefully, not with the precision of a king who managed everything. He kissed her the way the wolf had wanted to since the 3rd visit, completely and close and without a strategy for what came after. His hands in her hair, loosening the braid, the pencil falling from behind her ear and clattering on the scaffolding boards below. Her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, the warmth of him against the cold stone at her back. The world narrowed, the rain on the colonnade roof, the lantern's shifting light, the smell of wet limestone and cedar smoke, and her, rosemary and something underneath it, something that was just her, just Nora, the scent he'd been carrying in the back of his mind for 5 months without letting himself name it. All of it collapsed to this: her mouth against his, her hands on his chest, the specific, irreversible fact of her. She kissed him back with the directness of a woman who'd been waiting and was done with waiting. Her fingers found the pulse at his throat, fast, faster than a king's pulse had any right to be. She felt the growl building in his chest before she heard it, low, involuntary, the wolf in him surfacing not as a strategy or a scheme, but as simple, unmanaged want. It vibrated through her palm, through her rib cage, through every pretense she'd maintained about professional distance and contractual obligations and the appropriate relationship between a master builder and her client. And then she made a sound, low in her throat, not quite a growl, not quite a hum. The sound a wolf makes when it finds the thing it's been scenting. Her eyes, when he caught them, had gone deep forest dark, the green nearly black at the center, and the look in them was not the look of a woman who built walls. It was the look of something older, something that had been patient for a very long time and was done being patient. He'd seen her read buildings. He'd never been the building before. He pulled back an inch, just enough to breathe, his forehead against hers, his hands still in her hair, cradling the back of her head, his thumb tracing the curve behind her ear where the pencil used to live. "Nora," he said. Just her name, nothing else. Like it was the only word in any language that mattered. His eyes were pure gold now, flint, close to the surface, looking at her through Desmond's face, with something that had outlasted every scheme and every sabotage plan and every strategic draft in the Alder Tower. Not smug, not scheming. Present. The animal truth of him held up for her to see. She touched his face. The scar on his jaw she'd never been close enough to notice before. The heat of his skin in the cold air. The way he leaned into her hand, like a man who'd been standing in the cold for a very long time and had just been invited inside. 44 inspections, she said. And you kiss like that. We could have saved a lot of time. The laugh that came out of him was real, not the managed almost smile, not the court-appropriate acknowledgement of humor. A real laugh surprised out of him that changed his whole face and showed her the man underneath the king. The one who'd been listening to her talk about mortar and memorizing every word. The one who'd been too afraid of his own voice to use it and had finally shown up, without a folder or a pretense or a structural concern. She kissed him again, slower this time. The kind of kiss that isn't urgent because it doesn't have to be, because the question has been answered and what's left is the luxury of knowing. His arms around her, her back against the colonnade wall, the limestone she'd placed with her own hands, warm from his body heat and steady as everything she'd ever built. The lantern flickered, the colonnade held. The wall, the sound, solid, beautifully constructed wall, held everything it was meant to hold. Home, Flint said, quietly, for once without strategy, without irony, without the smugness that had carried him through a week of competitive espionage. Just the word, delivered honestly. Home. Nora's wolf answered, not with a word, with a sound like settling. The deep, satisfied sound of a foundation accepting the weight it was always designed to bear. Him. Lachlan left the next morning. He was gracious about it. He was a prince, and grace was his currency. He'd told Desmond the previous evening, privately, over whiskey in the study that still smelled faintly of relocated library books. She chose you, he'd said, without bitterness. She chose you before I arrived. I think she chose you before you chose yourself. You're a fortunate man, Your Majesty. Try to deserve it. In the courtyard, he kissed Nora's hand and said, "The better man didn't win, Lady Dunmore. The slower one finally showed up." She smiled. He smiled back. The real one, the one that was slightly sad and entirely generous, and mounted his horse, the normal-sized one that had been quietly reinstated overnight. Desmond stood beside her and watched the Greymane delegation ride out. His hand was at his side, 3 inches from hers. She closed the distance. Their fingers interlaced. He looked down at their hands, her stone-dust knuckles against his scarred ones, and the expression on his face was the one he'd been hiding for 5 months. Unmanaged, specific. His. You replaced his horse with a smaller one, Nora said. I don't know what you're referring to. A pony, Desmond. You gave a foreign prince a pony. It was a compact horse. It came up to his knee. The corner of his mouth moved. It was a diplomatic gesture. It was inspired, Flint said, the smugness returning to its natural habitat. If we'd had another week, we would have salted his tea. Nora leaned her shoulder against his. It was a small thing. She'd built arches and colonnades and walls that would stand for centuries. She could also build small things, the kind that held just as much. No more inspections, she said. No? If you want to see me, you come see me. If you want to stand on my scaffolding, you stand on my scaffolding. No pretexts, no mortar concerns, no structural assessments conducted by a man whose structural expertise was acquired by standing too close to me for 5 months. I have acquired significant structural expertise. You have acquired the ability to identify limestone. That is one skill. I have 40. I would like to learn the other 39. She looked at him. He looked at her. The courtyard was empty now, the last of the Greymane horses disappearing through the gate, and the castle, her castle, the one she was building, the one he lived in, settled around them like a held breath. Then stop inspecting, she said, and start staying. Pemberton, standing 3 paces behind them with the instinct of a man who could smell a crisis resolution from 3 corridors away, permitted himself the smallest possible expression of relief. His expression suggested he was already composing the memoir. 6 weeks later, the restoration was complete. The east wing of Blackstone Castle stood in the autumn light, its limestone courses clean and true, its colonnade arches framing the mountains in the distance. Nora had built something that would outlast her, outlast the king, outlast the century. She knew this the way she knew mortar and stone, with her hands, with her certainty, with the part of her that understood what held. Desmond walked the finished wing with her. Room by room, arch by arch, his hand finding hers somewhere around the 3rd doorway and staying there. In the western colonnade, the one whose crew he'd stolen and returned in the space of a single guilty day, she stopped. There's one more thing, she said. She led him to the base of the colonnade where the cornerstone sat, the last stone laid, the one that anchored the whole structure. She knelt beside it and brushed away the mason's dust. Carved into the face of the stone, small and precise, in letters you'd never find unless you knew where to look. D and N. 3 his initials, and hers, and a Roman numeral. 3. The 3rd inspection, he said. The 3rd inspection. You knew at the 3rd, I knew at the 3rd. She ran her thumb across the carved letters. You smelled like certainty. You didn't know it. You thought you were hiding it. but your scent changed every time you stood near me. Cedar and iron, and something underneath that was just warm, just yours. By the third visit, I could read it the way I read mortar. Solid, load-bearing. She looked up at him. I'm a wolf, Desmond. I build things for a living, and I know what holds. You held. He stared at the stone. The king of the Blackstone Dominion, who'd spent 44 visits building pretexts, looked at the evidence that she'd known the truth since visit 3 and had carved it into the foundation of his own castle. She'd been building him into her work since the beginning. Into the walls, into the stone, into the structure of the only place he'd ever called home. He knelt beside her. The stone was cool under his palm. Her hand was warm under the other one. Outside the colonnade arches, the mountains were catching the last of the light, and the new stone of the east wing, her stone, her work, her gift to his kingdom, glowed the warm gold of limestone in autumn. I spent 5 months being afraid, he said quietly. And you spent 5 months carving my name into a wall. It's what I do, she said. I build things that last. He kissed her hand, the one with the stone dust, the one that had held trowels and compasses and pencils, and, now, him. She leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment they were just 2 people kneeling beside a cornerstone in the evening light, and the castle was quiet, and the wall held. It was always going to hold. She'd built it. Home, Flint said. Him, Moss answered. The evening light came through the colonnade arches, long and gold, and lay across the stone between them like an offering. Above them, the castle stood on the foundation she'd given it. Solid, lasting, built by a woman who knew what held, and a king who'd finally learned that the strongest structure in any dominion was the sentence you were brave enough to say out loud.